Our first port of call was Karnak, where there were many tour guides speaking in several different languages. The young gentleman appointed to our group had a quick and excited manner of speech, at times making it very difficult to follow. There were women dressed fully in black traditional clothing. Others were in their burqas. Many Westerners were also congregated here amongst the camels, donkeys, and heavy traffic. A large number of cats made this corner of the world their home, for they are loved in Egypt. Fruit vendors and souvenir shops lined the dusty roads. Of course, muezzin's prayer calls streamed through the open windows of luxurious coaches reserved for the tourists. Alas, the daily news one heard or read about, those buses being targeted by the fundamentalist movement, did not paint a joyful image. On the way to the temple side, our guide spoke about the New Kingdom period, and shortly after explained the day's program and next few days' itinerary. Tomorrow morning we are going to visit the western bank of Luxor city and necropolis. Later, we were to visit the temple of Queen Hatshepsut, sailing over the Nile. While heading to Aswan, we were to stop in Edfu and Kom Ombo, then proceed to the temples of Philae and Elephantine. There will be many interesting activities on board. Every night there will be different entertainment programs. This evening, after dinner, belly dancers will entertain you. While the guide explained those matters, Damon persistently asked me, "Is Serapis around? Are we going to see him physically, Suren?" But our guide was now talking about Karnak, the temple of Luxor, and the city being populated with around 80,000 people. Following the Greek period, when the Arabs conquered the land during the 640s AD, they preferred to call it by its present name. One could feel how bored Damon was, for he was once again tapping my shoulders and pointing at the mountains, where he was seeing a shape, as he claimed, of a bird, but there was nothing there. My attention was completely divided between the group we were with and what Damon was pointing at. "Look at the head! Look at the head!" while trying to listen to what was being said in regard to historic facts. Damon kept tapping my arms while I was videoing and impelling me to follow him into another direction. Come, Suren!" The only thing remaining seemed to be to have no interest in anything else other than answering his never-ending questions. It was very reminiscent of my past associates, starting with my ex-family. He was extremely nervous. "Now we are here. I want to see. I want to see. I want to see." These feelings I've had for a long time now. I felt a great need to theatrically pretend seeing his Mr. Magoya, and told him that his spirit guide was surely standing by him. "Magoya?" he asked. "Where?" Disappointed, almost crying, his eyes twirled like billiard balls. There was an awful expectancy born of unreasoning desire. It was impossible to explain anything to him, and it was impossible for Damon to realize that the imagined people, or those beings considered to belong to a higher ilk, could not be made visible on demand. On the other hand, Mr. Magoya had apparently helped him before, therefore no proof was needed. However, he firmly believed that something was going to be touched. Some doors opened, enabling him to see the invisible, as with those guardian angels, as considered within spiritual schools of thought. Damon stamped his feet in anger, shouting, "Now that we are here, I want to see. I want to see. I want to see." In a paranormal study, he would present a great concern in regard to what energies he was attracting to himself. It was a frightening experience, for I felt that I was in the presence of a man with murderous tendencies, feeling helpless but decisive to keep my cool. Soon after, he started pointing at a few more images on the rocks he thought he was seeing. I think he is beginning to show himself up and represent his image, isn't he? What the other might have meant was not clear. Was Serapis perhaps preparing Damon to see his image and favorite birds in those drawings, carvings, and statues similar to Horus? The air was extremely tense. Now we are in Luxor. Where is Serapis? I think it will be a great pleasure to see him. I was unable to utter a word, for I was shaken and thinking, what if he attempts to physically hurt me in his uncontrolled state of mind? Maybe he did not have his desperately needed herbs at the time. Serapis, as I have mentioned a few times before, was my childhood friend, but invisible to the exterior world. Besides, if it was possible to appear solid, he probably could do so, but was there any need? In some esoteric literature, Serapis was said to have declared that he was going to wait in Luxor. However, what was being interpreted could in reality mean a different place, a different Luxor. Therefore, such an encounter could only be made possible in a non-physical manner. A grievous sadness dawned in my heart, for I did not know how best to explain, waiting for an opportunity, but it was not yet the time. Who knew whether those from the invisible realm might or might not do the honors? But Damon furthered, frantically asking, "Are they going to be visible? Are they doing something?" Expectancy based upon dreams. Alas, certain so-called psychics are answerable. I was divided into two separate areas of conscious awareness, answering endless questions on one side, responding to mandates without a break to ponder upon them, and on the other, being inspired or even receiving valuable wisdom from another source. I could almost hear Serapis reminding me of important issues. However, those reminders may have been recalled memories. Damon kept demanding the keys to be given to him. However, I strongly felt Serapis' input. Due to his emotional state, those that he demands will not be fulfilled. When we were children, we accepted all things as the absolute reality. But as adults, we have rightfully become analytical about everything in the world. Yet I can confidently declare that it was a very pleasant experience to have a childhood friend who was always there when I felt all alone and frightened. I have never experienced ugly things, insults, and hatred from this friend. I kept outwardly completely calm and unstirred in the face of adversity. Soon I heard Damon tentatively whisper, I am seeing things, shapes, and colors, flashing. There are letters. I think it is like the letter Y. Was he perhaps seeing a pod about to open? There were extraordinary energies and a feeling of something very special in the air. Maybe those friends were very close. I thought Luxor would be different. Will they give me anything in Luxor? And also in Karnak? It seemed that somebody had made a promise, probably an unfulfillable one, but I did not promise anything. How could one react to this? I seemed to experience something horrific, like a panic attack or nightmare, and many darts of darkness being directed at me. A destructive force in thought was generated while I kept answering 1,000 more questions. What could one do in the face of such a conflict? I also felt the possibility of being murdered for my grave sins, without knowing the nature of them. This emotional state suddenly transformed into an astral exteriorization. distancing fast from the spot we were at. In that state of consciousness, I was able to see my own physique and Damon standing in front of me. He looked extremely agitated and angry, even from this considerable distance. Then suddenly I was aware of my surroundings, like waking up from a deep sleep. Obviously, I had experienced a psychologically explainable state of awareness. I heard Damon speak to me like a frightened little boy as he said, "Suren, you worried me. You were not moving. Like frozen, you know. You were standing straight. Unusual straight. Your eyes closed. Your voice was different, like a judge, like a king. And you said, 'We do what we can.' We're not obliged with childish things. I was scared, Professore." This newly developed situation lasted only a short while, and I was so happy to have recorded everything on my equipment, for I had forgotten to turn it off. Later still, Damon was a little calmer, but shouting, "Birds! More birds!" He was looking at images and statues of birds, similarly depicted in the hieroglyphs, and according to him, they were appearing out of the blue on the rock faces. I responded with, "Horus must be pretty busy today." While the tour guides spoke to their assigned groups, they all walked among the magnificent statues, but we moved off into another direction at his demand. Then Damon emotionally exclaimed, "They are teasing me. Suren, look, I know the feeling. They are teasing me." Then he continued with his unexpected lecture. "You know what I think? They know what I mean." His eyes glowed with hatred and pure anger as he clenched his fists. "You know what I mean?" he repeated over and over. I feel like cutting their link between them and me." Did he really mean what it sounded like? What could the fucking Serapis do if I strangled his fucking link? Obviously, he had no idea that I was trained in martial arts, but was calmly waiting for him to make the first move. I also felt that he was extremely frightened when he uttered the words, I hope they don't mess me around, Suren. I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed. Absolutely." Many tourists heard him shouting, but one had to remain calm, showing no emotions. However, I was certain that many people took note of the situation, for a number of them questioned me with a few delicate enquiries later. When the entire group we were with retraced their steps, Damon and I went off into yet another direction. For the observer, I must have looked like a faithful pet following his master, while the other kept singing his demands. If I don't get what I want, God forbid what I will do. In trepidation and fear, during the whole night following this day of emotional torture, I could not sleep, and instead recorded my impressions onto a number of cassette tapes. The following morning Damon greeted me with his spatial discussions at the breakfast table, continually asking why he had to be the chosen one, and why they needed a messiah. Even in the bus heading towards our next destination, he continued, "Why? Why? Because I'm a good person?" Raising his voice, "It doesn't work, unless it's a business deal." One thing was certain. He needed 1,000 praises. He continued, "It's not everyone can solve the problem like this, is it?" While the guide assigned to our group was busy talking about the pylons, supreme rulers, the emblems of Upper and Lower Egypt, as well as the pagan Christians, Damon was getting more and more bored. At the end of the day, and finally back on the boat, I was mentally exhausted and physically very tired. A beautiful sunset announced the end of yet another day, the warm desert air adding its own charm, and we did not need to go out to visit another temple or experience a light and sound program regularly presented at those historically significant sites. One wished to close the doors on a day filled with disappointments, angry debates, and thousands of repeated questions of no value. Even evening meals were spoiled by constant demands. I had no one to turn to other than wait until I was able to fall asleep. That is, when allowed. It felt as if I was enslaved, sacrificed, and wasting away for an unworthy cause, chasing the wind. I was shouted at, chastised, and treated almost like a naughty toddler needing to learn the real issues of life as seen fit by Damon. He regarded himself as being the only subject of importance. He was the businessman and a great divinity. But for now I was glad to leave all that behind, feeling tired and lonesome, and fell asleep. Would my mind self wander into other dimensions many people in general prefer to ignore? Eventually settling back, I began to drift into that eternal silence we are all familiar with. We call it sleep. For a short time, in the world of dreams, I might have been doing a nice REM dance. Maybe there was a habitual expectancy, but I was not certain. However, I was aware of the presence of different streams of existence. Soon, I was hearing the voices of familiar people talking to me, and thankfully none sounded like Damon. That experience did not feel like a physical one, and I thought it must be yet another dream. I found myself gazing upon the general environment, buildings, animals, people as we had seen since our arrival to this part of the world. Then I felt myself distancing away from the Nile. Was this also a wish fulfillment? I could not imagine. But I would be immensely happy if I did not have my traveling companion's company. Gradually, I was once more in familiar surroundings. In that state, I heard someone speak to the people gathered there. As you will discover, those immortals at the time lived on planet Earth, and they came from another world. Then the speaker mentioned someone who was able to float within a network of light rays, the son of Enlil. Another explained how Ninurta utilized spatial equipment, and he was able to throw bolts of light. Somebody else spoke about the stories in the known Bible. For instance, Lot's wife turning into ash. Everything spoken of literally became a visual experience right in front of me, just like those science fiction films depicting awesome space-oriented battles. Later they spoke about Hammurabi and his reports in regard to the gods who were once worshipped, like Shamash, the Mesopotamian sun god. Others spoke about Gilgamesh, the great ruler of Aratta. The scenario became a visual spectacle of the books I was keenly interested in reading. No matter what aspect of ancient history was considered within this outside world, there was peace. When pondering about my own past, however, I often recall how some people have tried hard to force their ideas on me. They considered me as being different and not following the norm. My condition, despite all their efforts, was not a disorder. Whilst enduring my unfortunate misadventure with Damon, I was suffering extreme fear. Would my door be knocked for totally dreamt of scenarios, obliging me to respond to ever more tiresome questions? He had to find additional faults with my person to be more critical on a daily basis. For example, why did I not take more shirts, socks, and perhaps underwear with me? Why did I stink? He even told me how embarrassed he felt in front of people when I was near him. In other sessions, I further endured being forced to pretend as if believing in him, being the real Messiah as he himself believed. Nighttime seemed to offer me some respite, but that too was often denied. His dependency on herbal mixes made things very difficult. During this period of time, my only true friends were invisible, and in fact, for the outside world they were simply non-existent. I sometimes wished that there was a spacecraft to board and travel into far distant worlds, or enter into different times of a distant future. That was a wonderful thought. Some of the experiences one might have had in regard to such journeying had to be kept to oneself for fear of being ridiculed. Imagine if Damon too, as he demanded, had an experience of this kind. How would he react? Was he at all ready for something like that? Would his habits of virtually living on hallucinates help or hinder him? When, Professore, when will they come down and lift me up? They have to, Suren, they have to. When my short sleep came to an end, and I woke up suddenly, I felt the urge to go up to the upper deck. But did I really want to? I looked around me, noticing the blissful silence. Everybody and everything appeared asleep. It was a beautiful and warm night, but my mind was painfully crowded, worrying about 1,000 more concerns imposed upon me, leaving no room to ponder on my own needs. I became aware of a voice constantly urging me to go up and sit somewhere on the upper deck by the swimming pool. It was a voice, but not one I was accustomed to. It could be worrying for someone who had never had the experience, for it would be considered a disorder and a form of hallucination. I was extremely fearful about being loaded with even more concerns, which did not belong to me. Alas, Damon was also on the upper deck. "Suren, Professore, I knew you'd come. They told me. Magoya told me." I responded, saying that there was something very special in the air. Although he appeared to agree with me, he was still heavily smoking his herb. What I felt was very familiar to me, and I heard the same voice again. This time it told me, "We are not far away from you. Look up towards your north, and see the bright golden glow. Can you see it? Point it out to your companion, if you wish." Damon was indeed looking in the direction of that bright light, which appeared suddenly, but he was unusually silent. In that instant he looked like a sleepwalker. His eyes were open, yet he was mesmerized. That delightful gold and white sphere of light gradually grew in size, so that one could determine its details. Its rims were adorned with lights which randomly flashed on and off in the most brilliant colors. I cautiously asked what he thought about it. Damon kept staring in the direction where that bright light had originally been, and not where it now was. It was an object silent, circular in shape, but from the side view looked like two very deep bowls placed face to face upon each other. Even its reflection on the waters of the Nile was as bright as itself. One wondered how many others might have seen it. Perhaps it was better that only a very few people had, or, better still, nobody had taken any notice. It was long past midnight. I spoke to Damon softly, asking what he thought of this experience, but there was still no movement, no response, and strangely, there were no questions streaming out of him. Had he been frozen in time? I was again aware of the voice which, in my head, sounded outside as if coming from within the physical surroundings. It told me not to be unduly concerned, for no one would be able to detect them. Did my associate hear it also? The voice further explained that they intended to let both of us into their transporter, but I wondered how it could be. Had I fallen asleep or passed out on the upper deck, perhaps? Was I still dreaming? Then I heard the same voice reassuring me that none of the above was applicable. "There are others waiting for you." Damon was also to be included in this transportation procedure. I wondered what his reaction would be like on our return. Would he be satisfied with his experience? Would he remember it all? But what I felt was that he was probably to remain asleep, recalling nothing consciously. I still remember the shimmering beam of light, the warm feeling when subjected to it, and yet experiencing shivers, as if cold ice cubes were placed on the nape of one's neck without being so. Remarkably, when on board, I experienced no sense of anxiety, even when observing the Nile Symphony from a considerable height. Suddenly we were in a darkly lit dome-shaped chamber. The interior glowed dark purple and indigo at first. Above, and in the center, there was a circular pale blue light, diffused yet creating a wonderful display. The most amazing observation was that there was no visible source of light. Two people approached us clothed in almost metallic skin-tight uniforms. They walked with us, and when going into different directions, we seemingly passed through walls. However, I was unsure if there were actually any walls. We found ourselves in an unusual-looking compartment, with warm colors of light occasionally changing to white. Obviously, the frequency ranges of visible light were changing according to need and the environment. I questioned if this was a self-induced state of consciousness, perhaps wishful thinking leading into a beautiful dream. However, here I was, and sharing the experience with Damon. It felt as if we were conducted into a holographic world. Soon after, Damon was no longer motionless, asking me, as I remember, "Professore, what's going on? Are they showing us something? Maybe from Mr. Megoya?" I assured him that I was seeing the same things he did. He was unusually calm, making me wonder if this was still a dream. After all, because for him to be calm like this was impossible. I became aware of some beautiful music, not originating from the world, and at times it resembled a well-coordinated choir. I wanted to believe that Damon was aware that he had finally been taken aboard a spacefaring craft, as he so ardently desired. I could not get over how one felt upon entering the craft. An overwhelming sensation of security and peace. Several other people introduced themselves according to their positions on board this amazing vessel. When people entered and exited from one area to another, I could not see any doors or openings, like we are accustomed to, other than the walls allowing entry on approach like the iris of an eye, and closing without any evidence of their existence. There were glass-like bubbles of huge proportions, which grew in size while displaying three-dimensional signs and images wherein one could see the outside environment of the craft, stars, galaxies, planets, and anything in regard to history. Had these advanced friends also perfected time travel? The seats were extraordinarily soft, and there were a number of highly advanced, cultured, and highly intelligent beings who were not altogether human-like in appearance, occupying them. We were strictly advised not to describe their looks to others on our return. However, there were no restrictions in talking about humanoid-looking people from different recesses of the galaxy. Many people we were introduced to were of high echelon and stature. Some were extremely tall, others smaller than the average human. I inquired in thought about what had really happened over the centuries, and indeed how we humans could have landed in the world. I was always interested in ancient history, whereas my traveling companion preferred to ponder upon other subjects. The audience were not only gazing upon an audiovisual documentation of history which was not fully understood on Earth, but were also directly participating in constructive debates. For instance, I very clearly heard someone say, "What you are experiencing right now is not an imagined presence." Feeling more comfortable in this eventful occasion, I was happy to participate. I thought that this was a very colorful way to study the past, and being able to recall everything expressed and shown was also equally worth considering when writing down this part of my story. They shared a number of pictorials representing ancient cultures and the interrelationship between intergalactic peoples and Earthians, as well as the times when ancient cultures blossomed. Then our attention was directed to the so-called celestials and intergalactic visitors who chose to settle on Earth. A tall gentleman, who looked unusually different, spoke at length about this intriguing issue and made mention of the group of 12. The story of Shamash and other deities was also rather exciting to listen to. Others contributed to the wisdom shared, and we discovered that whenever Enlil wished to go somewhere, Ninhuta often took his place. Some were extremely gently touching a number of keys, resulting in unusual figures appearing on what looked like a console, their colors amber and blue against a darkened background. Others made mention of the nature of the Nephilim and the roles they played. One could clearly observe some of the archaeologically important artifacts whereupon ancient artists and sculptors portrayed their leaders with a pair of wings. I recall seeing some of them at the ancient temple sites, a lion's body with a pair of wings. This might have portrayed their might and ability to fly. Then again, somebody else mentioned, the Bible declared, there were the angels of Lord, the Malachim. Others explained in detail that the ancients used mechanical means to fly, even travel to distant worlds. When one considers the account regarding Ezekiel's whirlwind, one discovers a superior technology being utilized, if one can accept it as a possible reality in the quantum sense. While humanity is on the verge of great changes, not doom and gloom as some tend to prophesy, it needs to be understood that the history of the ancients could point the way and lead to correctly predict what the future will be like. A while later, my good friend Soltek made an appearance, telling me that this was most certainly not a fantasy. We chose first those friends with a retentive memory and much kindness in their hearts. They are the ones who can take the information shared herein to millions of other seekers of truth around your world. Do not concern yourself unduly, for you will remember everything. Gazing upon the central control mechanism, there appeared unfamiliar inscriptions. Above this, there was a globe which began to display the exterior of the craft. There were so many subjects to be considered, one of which was the workings of the universe and development of galaxies and other livable planets. We were to be informed about them more thoroughly at a later time. For a moment we stood there observing the magnificent starry heavens and other objects as our ship traversed. My feelings were mixed. The time passed so quickly, and soon we were back above the Nile. Obviously, we could not stay in this environment for too long due to our physical needs. This is when we were directed to the half-spherical chamber, wherefrom we were to be transported back onto the boat. Damon once more stood like a statue, while the descent was made. The streets were now very quiet, almost deserted, only a few people to be seen, completely unaware. Lights flickered, reflecting on the rippling waters of the Nile. Had anybody seen us? Standing on the deck, I gazed after the fast disappearing and distancing craft. My associate, animated as anticipated, remarked on the bright star, which was no longer there. I deliberately asked him what the time was, and Damon seemed to be bewildered, asking, "How long were we standing here, Professore?" Indeed, a long while had passed. It was the early hours of the morning, and the sun was soon to rise. Going back to my berth, I decided to record my unique experience onto a cassette. Being forever skeptical and always questioning everything, I pondered, was the whole experience real? Under normal circumstances, it was impossible, But then again, was it? Could both of us, Damon and me, be under some form of hypnotic trance with a wish-fulfillment element to it? Was this the reason why the experience felt real? Were we hypnotized by somebody from a very long distance, providing us with a believable scenario? Did we time travel? The experience was absolutely real, and the time shift was also true. By just looking at a very bright star in the sky, which could just have been a naturally occurring phenomenon, could one jump from one moment in time to 2 or 3 hours later? In the morning, one of the staff on board the Nile Symphony told us that he saw us looking at the huge moon late last night and wanting to share cups of tea served in a traditional Egyptian samovar, discovered that we were suddenly not there. My undesirable association with Damon continued, he being extremely critical, always ready to find fault in all aspects of my life, and extremely abusive in his general attitude towards everybody around him. Obviously, he needed to feel superior and above everybody else. It may have been due to the way he was brought up from his childhood days, or his involvement with hallucinates and amassed, even accumulated monetary wealth. In some ways, it resembled the story of a poor farmer whose son promised to educate himself and became a king. When this king was in control of his domain, he ordered his servants to fetch his poor father from the farm to show him what a great king he had become. The poor farmer told his son that he was proud for his achievements, and was also very saddened, for in truth he had not yet become a man. In this model, one discovers that all the wealth one may have is of no value when the person in question cannot behave like a human being. I was often asked by the other tourists from the worldwide community during this wretched adventure if I was Damon's brother, who was always shouting at me and arguing, or was he my boss, chastising me while I remained calm, never raising my voice. There were also those who, in complete honesty and genuine concern, asked me to tell them discreetly if my life was in danger. Despite trying to explain to them that everything was in order, they found it very hard to accept. A few of them were police officers from overseas currently holidaying in Egypt, who offered their help. The situation as observed between us was indeed orchestrated by Damon, and embarrassingly noticed by others. Was it not he who wanted to gain fame and glory in the eyes of people? During the time we spent visiting places, not to discover anything like the past, but rather to be chastised in the hustle and bustle, when a child approached asking me if I was from India, sadly Damon felt the need to shout and swear at the child. Whenever somebody from a tourist or local background wanted to talk to me, he behaved as if I was owned by him, always ready to command to follow him into another direction, to question me, expecting immediate answers. Any light-hearted moments one might be having with other visitors were considered as stupidity, leading to much-needed chastisement in front of everybody. 2 American ladies, one a practicing psychologist, advised me again discreetly to leave the other and fly back home, or, if I chose to go with them to recover from the observed tyranny I was subjected to on a daily basis, I could stay at their home. It was refreshingly surprising to know that the world was not devoid of real humans. However, the air remained tense all the time, even when we returned to Cairo after our Aswan visit to take yet another flight into Alexandria with our first tour guides and Ani. We stayed at one of the most luxurious hotel complexes where I have filmed and photographed magnificent sunsets, and for a change I was left alone with one of the guides, Muhammad Makram. For a short while, visiting touristic and historically significant sites, ancient burial chambers, military museums, and war memorials, while Demon remained with his circle of friends, most importantly smoking grass with them. His interrogations were never-ending on a daily basis, and continued well into the late hours of the night. A few days later, we returned to Cairo, staying at Ani's place, visiting his family and doing some horse riding, before taking yet another flight on Lufthansa to Frankfurt. I had to put up with a bitterly disappointed, cranky, and bewildered individual. A little while later, we flew to Los Angeles on United American Airlines. Our journey was in first class, during which I was forever interrogated and subjected to extraordinary lengths of first-class corrective advice on how to live. Anything of the gentler kind was considered unacceptable, judging by the feelings experienced and words constantly repeated. I can never forget when we were still on board the Nile Symphony, Damon raising his voice for everybody to hear how disgusted he was with me. Go and buy yourself T-shirts or something from the souvenir shop. You can't walk around like that. It's embarrassing. People stared in our direction. I had only taken the necessary number of shirts for that part of our trip. Was he really and genuinely concerned about my well-being, or did I look poor and therefore unworthy to stand next to his greatness? He was wearing just a few of his T-shirts all the time, and our clothes were often dry-cleaned. He was sweating heavily, perhaps due to his smoking habits, but I had to be the smelly one. He treated me as if I was a young child or imbecilic. I often stood by the window, watching the waves from my berth, when I had any chance to be by myself, but tears kept rolling down my cheeks as I asked why life had to be full of cries. Even at night, when visiting any of the temples with our group, he displayed his anger, asking me, "Why are you doing all this? Videoing, recording, taking pictures. Why? 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 What are you going to do with them?" It was extraordinarily surprising. Was he not encouraging me to take pictures, often using his camera? His eyes glowed red, and his face reminded me of the devil we see in religious works of art. "But you are not going to get any dollars with them. I can tell you now. Not from this." "Why? Why are you doing it anyway? I'm asking you. Why? Why?" It seemed everything had to be equated with money. "But," yelled Demon, making everyone stare in our direction, "I don't seem to get any answers from you." I again felt that some psychics have done the utmost evil deed, for they all told him that he was a great king in his past. "I was, wasn't I?" Then he would continue, "Was my level similar to Ramesses, Serapis, Michael? What was that other asshole again? Archangel or what?" On the other hand, whatever he thought of me was anybody's guess, for he was demanding that, thanks to his psychic friends, I predict about the house he wanted to build when we were back in Melbourne. They might have classified me with my looks, hair color, and accent as a great wizard. Assuming that Shirley and I were closely related, Damon believed I would meet her when we were in Los Angeles. That is, if she was not engaged in another film shoot. I probably would, if the circumstances were different, and I was not with him. However, our South American, indeed Peruvian, journey was the worst, not due to its rugged mountains, empty deserts, and colorful people, but because of my association with Damon. He could not be anything other than disappointed. "Maybe we should have come here first, Professore." This time he was consulting his pendulum, if anybody was telling the truth or not. On top of that, he was convinced that there was somebody in charge of the pendulum he had obtained, and he was certain that a woman from another century was controlling it. Apparently, her name was Marika. What we observed was that the capital, Lima, was a poverty-stricken city, not well maintained. Its buildings were ornamental, but had not been well preserved since their construction in the last century. They were not like the great cities of America or Australia. He could not wait until we went to Cusco, and the accommodation in a luxurious hotel was more acceptable to him. There were a few young girls seeking adventure, but one was his favorite, and he wanted to pay her expenses to come to Australia if I wanted to have her for a girlfriend. How generous of him! When he observed the outskirts of this great city, seeing a number of shanty houses made of tin and other cheap materials, he was full of resentment. Eventually, we took a ride on an old train, turning, twisting, and zigzagging while climbing up to the top of the mountain towards Machu Picchu, but he did not enjoy the adventure. Hearing stories about mudslides made him fear for his life. He had his usual tantrums when we finally arrived at the warm water pools, which are famed for healing properties, and where Shirley had spent some time. It was cold, but those pools provided ever-needed warmth. Whenever we were up there, we also came across a number of students wanting to talk to us, but you can guess what his reactions were like. I would like to think that Damon had some fun, but he bitterly opposed me spending time with a shaman and his family in their souvenir shop. I was keenly interested in discovering more about their Inca culture and beliefs. When visiting a restaurant near the hotel where we were staying, we discovered that the owners, an American gentleman and his Peruvian wife, were very anxious in case the locals did not want any more gringos, as they called them, staying in their country. When we took a bus trip to visit the temple site at Machu Picchu, Damon continued to display his characteristics, telling me to fuck off and walking towards the altar in the distance, expecting me to follow him. Speechless, I stood there for a short while and then sat in a corner, watching him go down to where others were also walking, and I took several pictures before I went down there on my own. He did not see me, and did not bother. Soon I retraced my steps back to the point where we had first arrived. I could see him walking aimlessly into any direction, but, like a few other people, I gazed upon the sky, seeing a number of UFOs, and 3 of those amazing lights hovered over the area before swooping gently and silently towards the visitors in the temple site. I took photographs of them, while wondering how many people had noticed them. Then, needing to leave the scene, I walked back to catch the bus to return where we were staying. It was a very long wait, and the sun was about to set, but the other tourists were having lots of fun Finally, Damon emerged from the crowd, his usual characteristics apparent. He said that he was worried in case I had left, was gone, or had committed suicide. I told him what I did was exactly as he requested of me. Did he by any chance hope that I would have committed suicide? Back in Cusco, having answered further questions and taken a bus trip to another part of Peru, passing through desert dunes and some rough terrain, we visited the Nazca lines. I was keen to meet Maria Reiche, the German researcher who had dedicated her entire life to discovering Inca and the current Peruvian society. But Damon was not interested in anything like that. However, a flight over the Nazca lines was a delightful experience in a Cessna. During the flight, Damon continually asked me to release the cover over the passenger's seat, for he felt very hot. Co-piloting and, at the same time filming, was not an easy task, while putting up with Damon's fear of heights, which was not at all ideal. Finally, we made our way to Lake Titicaca, visiting the straw islands whereupon people lived, fished with their families and pet pelicans on the blue waters of the lake between Peru and Bolivia. They lived on fish caught daily for all their dietary needs. A leaky boat trip took us to one of the islands, and we were accommodated together with a few other tourists, some of whom were of Israeli background like Damon. Meeting the locals who were ever ready to make our stay pleasurable was remarkable. Little things like small packets of sweets or food items I gave to the children, and taking their photographs was one of my gravest sins as far as my traveling associate was concerned. In this high country, the oxygen levels made it very hard to breathe. It was more rarefied, making it difficult for tourists, especially those with asthma. The natives prescribed coca leaves to chew for those having a problem. At night, we were subjected to wood smoke filling our rooms. I could not sleep, and so spent my time outside, talking to the natives, partially in their native language, Quechua. They had been observing UFOs in the starry skies, considering them as vehicles of the deities. They believed that some white men could be from the skies, bringing famine or blessing upon the land. After their discovery of us as friendly aliens, the natives were ever ready to offer us all they had got, and were very saddened about our imminent departure. On the other hand, whenever Damon noticed glowing insects, and perhaps even other things, emitting light on the ground, he kept kicking and swearing at them. "Why in the world did you bring me to this fucking place?" Damon was unable to smoke his herbal mixes freely, and so, as he often claimed, it made his life hell. I was very happy when we left the country on American Airlines from Lima, although I would personally love to remain there longer if I had been on my own. I would most certainly help some of the native people with their children's schooling, even their well-being. However, having arrived at Los Angeles Airport, one could not miss how he desperately wanted to catch up with his other friends to fulfill his desire to smoke and be a part of the civilization, telling me that I would be bored with his friends, literally smashing my luggage on the concrete floor. Maybe, as it became customary for him to be physically searched by airport officials, it was the cause of his anxieties. But some of my photographic lenses and filters were damaged after his outrage. After he had hastily got a taxi to wherever, in front of the curious onlookers, I collected the pieces together with my luggage, depositing them with the airline for transit to Melbourne. Only then was I able to enjoy some solace in the airport's first-class lounge, and taking the opportunity recorded a few more of my impressions on the equipment I had in my pocket. This is also where I was offered several delightful delicacies by some television personalities who were demonstrating cuisine as they did on the American media. That was a pleasant surprise. I met some extremely rich people from Egypt, Bahrain, Ethiopia, and Britain while waiting for the first available flight back home late at night. While enjoying an interesting conversation with them, my eyes caught a glimpse of an Australian television series on one of the screens. I was so surprised to see Australian films being shown with English subtitles and wondered if they were presented particularly for Americans, as they could not understand Australian. I would have chosen to stay in Los Angeles if I had been able to get in touch with a number of other friends, some of whom were involved in the cinematic art, but it was not to be this time, for many were heavily occupied in film shoots, while others had prior engagements. However, talking to some over the phone made my short visit a little more pleasurable. I had to leave meeting them for another time. A few hours later I took my flight to Wellington, New Zealand. The first-class portion of the plane was empty, making me feel very special for a brief period of time, because I was the only passenger therein. It was an interesting experience, although I normally preferred to fly business class. And yes, I thoroughly enjoyed it without Damon. In fact, as I told Damon very clearly, I needed at least a month and a half to relax. I needed that time just for myself to be able to recover from my ordeal when traveling with him. I could now reminisce on some of my rare moments while observing the sunsets with a number of shamans on the top of mountains in Peru. Raising my arms up to stretch my aching muscles was taken as a gesture to the sun by the locals, who started doing the same, while uttering mantras and prayers to the gods. I heard them shout, "The gods are here," pointing at unusually bright objects, which were most certainly not aeroplanes, military aircraft, or weather balloons, making rather interesting loops and maneuvers, but, as usual, Damon remained seated and kept massaging the sides of his head, looking completely bored with the whole situation, perhaps thinking about why he had come all the way to this place with an idiot like me. However, on board the plane to New Zealand, when unusual and unnatural spots of light were observed, the cabin crew were more willing to talk about them, unlike other occasions. What I understood was that they often noticed them. They were sometimes detected on their radar or onboard equipment, but they were advised not to talk about them. An Armenian girl working as an airline hostess offered me a bottle of wine to take home. She even gave me her American address in case I visited the country again. On arrival at Wellington Airport, I discovered that the city was a little too steamy, yet the weather was still pretty pleasant. I could stay here a little longer, but feeling extremely exhausted, I decided to fly to Sydney after a short adjournment and a few pleasant refreshments. I was the happiest man in the world after arriving in Melbourne, looking forward to having a break from all that nonsense I was subjected to. When journeying, my imaginings, dreams, or associations with other dimensions, although the situation might have been thought as being a psychological trauma I suffered, were not because I am convinced that they were thought transferences from another source impossible to pinpoint. They were certainly from an unknown reality. More importantly, they were real to me. They could have been due to my imaginative creation of stories in thought, but not as pretense, or wanting to gain attention or admiration of others, for I never seek worshippers or followers. However, those experiences in the astral provided me with that ever-needed solace and some satisfaction in my yearning to know things. They were so beneficial during the times when I was not allowed to do anything else other than answering unrelated, illogical questions of no value. I felt that every moment of my life was stolen away, while I was expected to satisfy the mind of somebody considering himself as the only chosen, therefore having the right to own me just the way he was towards his other associates, friends, and family. I desperately needed to have a complete separation from him.